right, so you ever have those days where nothing goes right? So that's kind of the way today has gone. You were supposed to have a PowerPoint behind me, and then it was going to be on this little TV, and that didn't work. So now you have it on paper. So just bear with me. I want this to be really informal, and there will be times when we'll stop and you can fill in blanks because I know I'm missing a lot around the square. So I'll stop every once in a while and we can do that. So if you look through this brochure or this layout I've given you, the first thing you're going to see is the importance of historic preservation. And so one of the things that my parents are sitting over here and both school teachers, and so one of the things we did in the summer was they took me to every old house and every plantation and every old town and saw all of those. But that gave me this sense of the importance of historic preservation. And so I still drag Christy to all of these places, such as Charleston, South Carolina, and we go to Charleston at least once a year, to Natchez, Vicksburg, and places like that. So there's this growing sense of the importance of historic preservation, though I hate to say not everybody gets that. And so what you see on that first page, it should be our first slide, is this monastery in Fort Smith. And if you follow the news at all, the good sisters at the monastery are determined to tear this down. Yes. And you see the picture there. It's a beautiful building. Developers from all over the country have expressed interest in revitalizing this building, turning it into apartments and so forth, and they're just determined, it seems, to tear it down. In fact, Preserve Arkansas, which Dr. Pat serves on the board of, secured a $10,000 grant that would have allowed them to explore options, and they won't even accept the grant. So that tells you that there's some resistance to historic preservation. We've seen that in our own community with our school building and the drama there with saving the rock building. That next slide or next page shows, and that I apologize, that one is so pixelated. But you see Rainbow Row in Charleston, Fort Rosalie in Natchez, and then a house in Vicksburg. And these are just examples of places that have really restored and put an emphasis on historic preservation. The next slide you see is the Windsor ruins at Fort Gibson, Mississippi. So there's a funny story here. Several years ago, Christy and I hadn't been married a long time, and we set off to Natchez for a long weekend. And I had read about these ruins somewhere, and we were determined to find them. But it's before cell phones, before GPS, and so eventually we found them. You basically go to the Mississippi, and if you get wet, you've gone too far. It was an adventure, to say the least. But the Windsor ruins are a house that burned, I believe, in the 1880s after the war. It was one of the largest plantations ever built. Mississippi has preserved these ruins, and they're a draw for cultural tourism. So I just give you all of those examples to say there's so much that we could do to save buildings. And then I want to talk about what a treasure we have around the square. The next thing you see, though, is the cover of a new book that's coming out. This new pictorial history coming soon. Images of America, Pocahontas and Randolph County will be out in November if everything goes as planned. I'm waiting on the final set of proofs, but we only had trouble with 11 images we submitted, and so I think we're on track to have the new book out before Christmas. Anyway, that's the cover. That's the Slee Handle Mill on the cover, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
So now here's the struggle. We could only have like 200 images, so everybody's going to be upset about something that didn't make the book, but we tried to have a good sample. All right, before we move on to Pocahontas, though, I want to tell you about how you put a property on the National Register. And so I serve as the Vice Chairman of the State Review Board for Historic Preservation. And so the State Review Board, I know that Dr. Pat already knows all this, but the State Review Board is the state body that decides what can go on the National Register for Historic Preservation. So you come before a committee made up of historians and architects, attorneys, and we determine if your building would qualify for the National Register. And so there's this whole process. that you go through. And the state has a lot of resources, so don't think you have to do it on your own. If you have a house or a building that could qualify, the state will essentially come do the paperwork for you. We have an entire staff in Little Rock that's what they do. So what you do is you fill out the paperwork, you provide a lot of evidence, it goes before our board. Sometimes we reject them and ask for new evidence. Usually though, we pass them on to the Department of the Interior, and usually it's an easy process. Now one of the questions that people have had is, and I don't want to bring up controversy, but in relation to the rock building, can we nominate it for the National Register? And so I've dug into that, I've talked with our attorneys about that, and really the problem there is that the school district would have to sign on, or we probably wouldn't touch it. If the school district does not want it on the register, we probably wouldn't put it on the register. So that's a question that I've been asked multiple times.
Rodney,
Yes.
you may be bringing this up, but isn't it correct that this National Historic District, this downtown 17 block area, places all the historic structures within that historic district automatically on the National Register?
Yes, but it doesn't bring all of the limitations with it. And let me give you, let's see, the best example is Studio B. She called 2 weeks ago and wanted to talk to me. She painted her building. It's painted white now. It looks great, actually. And she wanted to talk about that to make sure that she wasn't going to be running afoul of anything. And because her building is not contributory to that, she's not. But the museum building, if we wanted to paint it, we would have a problem. So if you notice, I had a new roof put on a few weeks ago, and so I had to deal with the state to make sure that the kind of shingles we were going to put on it would be okay. And they're really great to work with on that sort of thing.
Yeah.
For instance, if I replace the windows in that museum, they have to be wooden. We can't go back with vinyl because it is a contributing building.
So how would you get another piece of property on the historical that's not in Pocahontas?
So the best way to do that is gather a little information yourself first. When was it built? What was it used for? Those kind of things. And then I can put you in contact with the people at the state, and they would come in and do a survey, they call it. And they would gather information and determine if it was eligible. It has to be at least 50 years old to qualify at this point.
I don't know if it is or not.
Yeah. It's amazing the buildings that are 50 years old at this
Well,
point.
this is not even actually, well, yeah, it is too. Well, anyway. It's the water wheel that's going towards Hardy.
Oh yeah, on the left.
Yes.
I have a feeling there's already a survey done on that, so I don't know. That may be kind of one of those that we do surveys on a lot of things and then you eventually get to them, so I don't know. I don't know how old it is but
I know I don't believe I was a teenager when it was built, because my father built it.
Okay.
And it was inside the building when the water wheel was going, it was grounding corn up.
It's a grist mill. Is that the right word? A grist mill?
It made cornmeal.
Yeah.
So how do we know if our building is contributory to the?
We can look, there's a survey of that somewhere, right, Linda, from when you all did it. We can get a copy of that to know which buildings contribute and which ones don't.
I remember us talking about it, but I don't remember what.
Right.
It's all on the state website.
Yeah, I think it's all online at this
Okay,
point.
so I could look,
Yeah,
'cause
and if you
that's
can't,
what
then I can help you find
said
it.
too, so
Yeah.
I think my corner building is, but I don't know if that's
What, I mean, age-wise, it would be. And the exterior was redone over 50 years ago to look like it looks now, so I'm sure it is. Okay. Any other questions?
So is there a way to?
Go ahead.
Is there a way to bring them back to their original, like the second building I have? I know it was redone because I remember it being redone.
The building that was grams and spikes, and, you're right.
And I remember how it was when it was posed.
Right.
But I'd like to redo some of that anyway,
Right.
because of structural issues on the inside. And if I could turn that back, how it looked.
Yeah, there are sometimes grants available to do part of that, and sometimes you just have to put forward the money before you get it on the register. But Dr. Pat can probably tell us a little more about that and the use of tax credits at some point too, to redo a building.
I
You
know
know,
a little bit about it because I got into that with the other building, but it was too late. So I know enough to know I gotta meet ahead of time with them, but that's about all I know.
okay. All right, any other questions before we talk about the square? All right, well, the first place I want to talk about is Futrall Pharmacy over here, and it kind of holds a special place to me. It was my first job. At 16, I went to work at Futrall's, working behind the soda fountain, and I just thought that was going to be a job, but it turned into kind of more than that. Phil really took me under his wing and wanted to introduce me to everybody, in his words, everybody I would need to know in Pocahontas, is what he told me repeatedly. And I vividly remember meeting Joe Martin for the first time, and Joe Martin's stories about his father, some of which I won't repeat. They were very intriguing. I remember the first time I met Linda was in the pharmacy. I don't know why I remember, but I remember that. So he would introduce me to people as they came through, and so that it holds a special place to me. It also holds a special place in our town's history. There's been a pharmacy on that location, let me look at my dates here, since before the Civil War. Now that building is not completely from before the Civil War. The first pharmacy on that location was in 1854. And the drugstore has operated on that spot since that time. It's the oldest pharmacy location in the state, in fact.
No matter what Argenta says.
Yes, that's true.
Argenta,
They
North Little
claim-
Rock claims,
Yeah, they do claim to have the oldest pharmacy.
and I think the oldest barber shop.
Yeah.
But anyway.
And the barber shop, I noticed that we have to add continuously operating.
Operating.
Yeah, yeah. So it's the oldest pharmacy location in the state. It's the oldest pharmacy location in town. But by the turn of the century, the south side of the square was an impressive collection of 1- and 2-story buildings. And you see that larger image there on the corner. That's Pringle Drug at the time on the corner, and that's a 2-story building there. And if you look on the, flip this sheet over, you'll see 2 distinguished looking gentlemen. And they are Dr. J.R. Loftus, who graduated from Vanderbilt Medical School in 1900, and his son, Dr. William Osler Loftus, who and I'm not sure where he went to school, but they both practiced in that building on the 2nd floor. I have a little question about that with the second one. I have doubts, but I'm sure that the senior Dr. Loftus did practice on the 2nd floor. And most of these buildings would have had something going on the 2nd floor.
Dorothy
Was
says,
my uncle,
Oh, okay.
and he practiced right across from his parents' house.
Okay. We did find, when we did research, a couple of different places where he had practiced. So, yeah.
No, it's the Loftus home, it was a white, it is a white
Yes.
two-story building that seems much loved always and taken care of.
The corner of...
it's where Carrie Story lives.
Yes, that's what they were telling me earlier. What, Everett and Thomasville.
And then across the street was my aunt that he married, Juanita, in that Tudor style home. And then they lived on, I believe, Highburn when they lived here. But he was in the service when they got married.
Interesting.
This one, the younger one?
The younger one.
Oh, cool.
I remember.
That's interesting.
That's neat. Yeah. So you see that impressive collection of buildings. The second 2-story building was the Court Square Hotel. And I'm kind of bouncing around here, but this format works for that. So that was the Court Square Hotel. There would have been businesses on the 1st floor, including the post office at one time, and hotel rooms on the 2nd floor. Just as a side note, the post office moved a lot because it was basically someone ant a contract to run the post office. So the post office bounced around in multiple locations. I found it on that block. I found it on the corner over here and on Pyburn Street. So it depends on the year where you found the post office. And that would be true until the 30s when the old post office was built. So that's not unusual. In 1914, a fire devastated this side of the square, leaving nothing but a shell of the pharmacy and other structures. They knocked down the walls up on the second floor and rebuilt quickly into a one-story structure that we see today. From 1908 to 1930, Pringle Drug occupied the location. And I wish I had pulled a photo of the Pringle house. It was very interesting and ornate. And I think you can find that on the museum website, though. The Pringle house had a lot of ornate detail on it.
And I think it was up there on Mars Street where Margaret Poe built that
Yeah.
ranch-style red brick house. So that's where the Pringle house was that you're talking about.
James?
They also had a pharmacy in Hoxie.
Oh, okay. That's
Oh,
interesting. Yeah. So in 1930, the pharmacy sold to Johnston and became Johnston Drug. And so the color photo you can see with the marching band, which I think is a really neat picture, that's when it was Johnston Drug. You can see part of the sign there, and part of the sign on the upper part of the building. And then in 1961, Phil Futrell purchased the store when he graduated from pharmacy school. It's been known as Futrell Pharmacy ever since. Today it's owned by Mark. It's a quick story about the building. When I worked for Phil, the basement was accessed by a trapdoor in the floor. You had to move stuff and raise this huge trapdoor, and then these stairs that were probably from about 1930 slanted as you went down, and there was a dirt floor basement under the building, and it was crammed full. And so he paid me and a friend that worked there, I don't even remember how much he paid us extra, but to clean it out. And we backed up a truck to the cellar doors outside and loaded trucks for days of junk out of there and hauled it off to the dump. So most of it was ruined by this point. Biggest rats I've ever seen in my life, but anyway.
Wow.
So not long before I went to work there, to change the soda things, for the soda fountain, you had to go to the basement and go to the front of the building and do it. And so that had changed by the time I worked there. But anyway, there was part of the original soda fountain was down there. I think Mark has since sold that to a collector, probably for huge amounts of money. So anyway, Mark I think has concreted that now and uses that for storage. So he's made some improvements, I know. Before we talk about the rest of that side of the square, let's talk about the hardware store across the corner. It wasn't built as a hardware store. In fact, you'll see the black and white images on either side of the slide are as a bank. It was built around 1900 and housed the Randolph County Bank. It's notable for several reasons, but probably locally the most notable reason is Lanty Martin was the youngest cashier in the state. And the cashier, we don't think of that as an important position today, but it was an incredibly important position at the time. And so he became the youngest cashier in the state. We know he went on to form his own lending organization and create really a large fortune. The left-hand image is Lanty Martin and J.D. Wells, someone who he would be in business with really all of their lives. And that is them in the bank as young men. Martin Agency actually started in this building as well. And Martin Agency is still in business, of course, we know today. The Randolph County Bank and the Pocahontas State Bank and the First National Bank all consolidated to form the Randolph State Bank, and it would then close during the Great Depression in 1946. And the Futrell family, it would close during the Great Depression, and in 1946, the Futrells bought the building and started a hardware store. And here's an interesting bit about the Futrells. So they were a series of, I think there were 6 brothers from Paragould, and they all owned hardware stores in towns like Pocahontas. But there's a catch they don't talk about. You know the back door? Get my bearings here. You know there's a back door when you go down the sidewalk that's boarded up?
I do.
That was a liquor store. They owned 6 hardware stores and 6 liquor stores. So that's where a lot of their money came from. And Marion Futrell's uncle was the governor of Arkansas. Julius Marion Futrell was the governor of Arkansas. And during the Great Depression, his answer to balance the books was to just quit building roads and stop paying teachers and close the schools. So, it tells you a little
Before
bit.
Mutual Hardware, Jerry Burrow had a grocery store
In that building?
And
Okay.
Linda's mother worked for him.
Okay. So before 1946, yeah. Okay. It's a neat building.
It
I'll be
is.
interested to see what Michael Dixon does with it now that he's bought it. Because the Futurals have sold the business and the building. And Michael Dixon apparently plans to put two apartments, I believe, upstairs. I don't know what he's going to do downstairs.
You know, we're very proud of our governor from Randolph County, and we have a big memorial to him out at the cemetery. But Governor Futrell at Paragould, he's in that big cemetery there, you know, at the corner of Kings
Yeah.
Highway. Just a regular little tombstone.
Governor
They
Futural's
need to do more
controversial.
than that for their governor.
But
What?
Governor Futural's controversial.
Oh,
He didn't want to accept any New Deal money. He was very anti-Roosevelt. So
well, maybe that's why.
he's controversial. But they do have the Futural House as a museum over there, I believe.
Yeah, I think they do.
So,
They did, they did.
yeah. All right, so I'm also told, I remember Marion telling me himself, because that was one of the neat things about working at the pharmacy, I got to know all those old men, that up until a certain time, I believe in the late 50s, he wore a suit to work every day in there. And in the summer, it'd be a white suit, he said. We sure don't do that now. All right, so let's go back to the Futurals and go on down. I talked to you already about the Court Square Hotel. This hotel operated on the second floor of the building. Other businesses along there were the Clerk Saloon, Martin Brothers Mercantile and Livery, the post office, as I already said. On the corner where the clerk's office is located today, and what I remember is the Bank of Pocahontas, stood another pharmacy in its first location, and that was Skinner Drug. Skinner Drug opened in 1866, and it would later move across the square over here, and now it's City Drug. So it's the second oldest pharmacy in town. And
City Pharmacy.
yeah, City Pharmacy. It's the second oldest pharmacy in town and probably one of the 5 or 6 oldest in the state, I would guess. The Clerk Saloon was over here roughly where the bar is today, and Clerk LP Gas. And we did have there's a story here, we did have the bar out of that until a few weeks ago, and the Clerk family really wanted it back. So we allowed them to take it back from the museum because we hadn't restored it yet. And we did get a hefty donation from them to get it back. So
Right. We were worried about that because we had to pay $750
but we doubled that.
to move it. Great, Rodney.
We doubled that.
Good.
So that was one of many saloons around the square. So the next picture is a different view of the same side of the square. If you'll notice, it's after 1914. The cars tell us that, the buildings. You can notice it's kind of pixelated, but you can see it's a line of one-story buildings with incredible old cars parked out front. There's a gas pump in front of what was later the Bank of Pocahontas. That was a Chevrolet dealership for a period of time
What is
there.
the Foster's?
It was just probably a mercantile store. But that was the Chevrolet dealership. So we think about you got to have a big lot to park all the cars. Well, they wouldn't have had that many cars anyway. So anyway, notice the streets are still dirt. That was interesting.
So I don't reckon they had chicken trucks coming through, so.
No chicken trucks.
Might have had chicken.
That's true. I thought that.
Now, there's something called a Sanford Insurance Map. So in 1916, we have one from 1916, 1922, and 1933. And so the Sanford Insurance Company came through town and documented the whole square, the whole downtown, actually. And so between 1914 and 1922, and so I'm going to say that this building, where the Bank of Pocahontas was built after 1922, because the 1922 Sanford map shows that as a vacant lot. So I would say that was not rebuilt after the fire, and then that building was built sometime after 1922.
And I guess these are electric poles,
Yes,
aren't they? Yeah, we got electricity in 1911, I think.
we had our own power plant down by the river, generated our own power. We did several things very quickly. We got electric, we got our own telephone. As I tell my students all the time though, Maynard had a telephone network and Pocahontas had a telephone network, but you couldn't call each other. You couldn't call Maynard. You could only call the people that had a line from the office in Pocahontas. And the people in Maynard could only call people in Maynard. So you couldn't pick up the phone and call Maynard. So let's look at one more picture. Not one of my favorite pictures. This is from the 1880s. And you see Skinner Drug there. That's the corner where the Bank of Pocahontas was. Later you see the Randolph Herald. Was on that side for a period of time, precursor to the Star Herald. And then there would have been a pharmacy that we can't see in the picture. Notice they're wood frame buildings at this point.
And that's before they burned, right?
Well, that's before one fire. There's been 2 fires on the south side of the square. So we would have lost the wood frame buildings at one point. Then we would have built those impressive brick buildings. And then there was a fire. And now we have our one-story buildings.
I recently ran across another photo, apparently made this same day, from farther to the right, that shows on to the left the pharmacy area.
Okay. Yeah,
I'll try to remember
right.
to send it to you.
good deal. Do you remember what year the Herald started, by chance?
No. I know the Star and the Herald were combined in
Right.
1880, but I don't
And then
know.
they're the oldest business in the county.
Right.
All right, so let's move to the north side of the square where the museum is today. So on the south, or north side of the square, I'm sorry, I remember there being a dry cleaners. I remember Burke's being there, McDaniel Appliance, and Murray Grodder's Law Office. Those are the things that stick out in my mind. That's when I was growing up.
Drugstore, Sterling.
Yeah, but that was before me.
I think he is. And I think I am.
I can
I
see.
don't remember Turner Saloon.
I can see 50, but I'm not there yet.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
I don't either. I'm not filled this morning.
So the building located at the corner of Bettis and Everett, where Grodder's Law Office was, and it's now sitting empty, was built in the 1920s. It's the home of Pocahontas State Bank. You'll see it has a little bit of a different look, and in this picture it actually says First National Bank on it, because it's been the home of several banks. Pocahontas State Bank, First National Bank, Bank of Pocahontas was there at one point. Farmers and our Planters and Stockmen started there.
That's where my dad
Yeah.
used to bank when I was little.
So it's been several banks. Pocahontas State Bank was organized in 1903, but it failed during the Great Depression. For a while, Pocahontas did not have a bank during the Great Depression because they all had failed. We went from 1930 to 1931 without any banks. The building also housed later Pocahontas Savings and Loan, founded by Landy Martin, and was the home to Martin Agency that we've already discussed. The rest of the buildings, if you'll turn the page, you'll see a couple of different views. You see one from about the same era as
That's what I was looking at.
the other side. If you notice, City Hall was in the building that Thrush Law Office is in now.
Oh, yeah.
And Lemon's studio was also in that building, the photographer.
Huh.
Okay, this is not on this side of the square, but when was the jail operated that's behind the new courthouse?
It was built in the late 30s or early 40s. Because the jail prior to that was where the Imperial
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
And we have a photo of that, and I believe it was built in the late 30s. Joe Decker was kind of leading the way on that.
And it stood there until probably the 70s.
Oh, it was later than that.
Well, whenever they
80s?
built the new city hall, when they tore it down.
Well, no,
Really?
no, it was after that because when I got my driver's license the first time I went there.
But they weren't using it for a jail.
No, but they were using it for the revenue office for years after that.
Well, now, I can remember when I was little, my mom was going in to tag the vehicle, and somebody was in jail there and hollered out to her. I never will forget that, but I don't know who was in jail.
That's funny.
I think I know who it was.
I just,
Wouldn't you, Judy?
No, it wasn't. I'm afraid I wasn't old enough to tell.
So in this image, you can see the light poles here as well. So that kind of gives you a time frame. And that bottom image is from the Centennial. The lady's posing in front of the building. So then we move on to the next picture. Linda mentioned the Turner Saloon that she doesn't remember.
No, I don't remember that.
So there's an image of the Turner Saloon and the drugstore next door.
Yeah, yeah, Skinner was in where Studio B is.
Yeah.
Which is where Burke's was.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. What's interesting to me is then where the museum building is was a one-story building at this time still. So we can date that actually a little bit, and we'll do that here in just a minute. I wanted to go back and add something about the bank. The Bank of Pocahontas, its first home was in the building here that Grider Law Office was in.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And the Bank of Pocahontas was founded when the Bank of Biggers and the State Bank of Success merged in 1931 and moved to Pocahontas, in part because we did not have a banking institution. So just kind of an interesting history. The rest of that block appears to have been built by Spinweber and Peters around 1898. This Turner Saloon picture is going to predate 1898, though, I think. And so, in actuality, there's some question about whether they built all of those buildings or not. Herbert Arnold Peters immigrated from Germany. He eventually settled in Pocahontas in 1880. For a time, he taught English at St. Paul's and worked as a bookkeeper for Lute Imboden's mercantile store. In 1890, he formed a business partnership with Ferdinand Spinweber, and the two men then built these commercial buildings in Pocahontas at 106 East Everett Street, where the museum is today. The business grew and prospered, and the partners added to the building, extending it all the way to Moore Street. Some of that I have questions about because of this picture, but that's based on their records. These buildings later contained the Turner Saloon, the St. Louis Bargain Store, Burke's Pharmacy, and later Perrin Pharmacy, and Jansen's Grocery. Here's my favorite story about the museum building, though. The Knights of Pythius, if you look for
Love this. I love this.
the next image, I think, I may have these, there's a few images, skip over a few images, we'll come back. The Knights of Pythius, that's not our local chapter there. I can't find a picture of our local chapter. But the Knights of Pythius were a lodge, sort of like the Oddfellows. And they had their lodge hall in the upstairs of the museum. And if any of us have, and I guess we've all heard of the hanging of Chevry, however we say his name. They basically, the story I get is they got liquored up at Turner's Saloon. Then they went and had their lodge meeting. Then they went around the corner to where the theater is today and broke him out of jail so they could kill him. But they probably made that decision on the second floor of the museum. So that's the basic story there, right?
That's why there's not a picture of them today. I think they all didn't want to be known because they were the lynch mob.
That's right. Yeah. And in the process, they injured John Kaiser, who was a deputy sheriff at the time, who would later, of course, go on to have his own infamous stories.
Well, and a fellow named Carter who died on his way to Barnes Hospital, I guess, in St. Louis.
Right.
Min Carter.
Was it Min Carter?
So that location is linked there. You see two images of crowds in front of these buildings today, or these buildings we're talking about. the first one, the one that's kind of multicolored, the picture didn't duplicate well. You can see this is the 1930s, and so the buildings have undergone quite a bit of change. We've changed the windows in those. And this is just a gathering on a Saturday, that first one.
Wow.
You mean this one?
Yeah.
Wow.
The second one is a group of WPA workers. And so you see they're standing at the corner of Bettis and Everett. And you see Lemon's studio there. There's also a grocery store there on that corner. You see the bank behind, and then that tall building you see is the museum building. The lower building there between the bank and the museum is the annex. So this is a group of WPA workers just posing. If you look, they all have a shovel or some tool that you can make out.
So the museum had the second story by the 30s.
Oh, yeah.
That's great news. It's a break upstairs there.
And then the next image is a little blurry, but I liked this image, and it's another one of the band. And somebody who's a car person, Dad may be able to tell me what years that car is.
Late 30s, early 40s.
I'd say this picture's from the mid 40s probably. And you see that's Burke's. You can see with the canopy what I knew as Burke's, and that's the museum with the line of windows up at the top. And then there's the Pocahontas marching band.
Burke's.
And that says beauty shop on it, so I think that already says Burke's at that point.
Would there have been a marching band in the 40s, Nanny?
Yeah, I would think so.
At one
Would
point
that
we
have
had
been
a
the majorette uniform?
Yeah.
Oh, see, I thought it was the 50s.
in the 40s we had a Randolph County band made up of Maynard and Pocahontas. And there's actually a picture of that I could have thrown in here, but it was a county band a lot of those years, which I'd never encountered before. But I'm sure they drew from small schools before consolidation too. All right, let's talk about the east side of the square. So this is an interesting image. This is probably from that, maybe 1880s, probably 1890s. And there's several things to point out about it. So it's a band playing, no big deal there. It's the Pocahontas Coronet Band, we can see. But the building behind it is the St. Charles Hotel. And the St. Charles Hotel predates the Civil War. The building you can see, the brick building, it says Famous Cash Store, if you look closely, is the building that Dr. Pat is redoing as we speak. It has been for a while, right? It was part of the hotel as well. So this hotel establishment really went from the corner all the way down almost to the other end of the block at one time. And so this is the St. Charles Hotel. It was under the management, well, let's back up. The white building that you see behind these people, it was built in, get the date right, 1854. So this is quite the hotel establishment that started in 1854.
William Allaire.
Who was an architect.
from New York.
Yeah, that ended up here somehow.
Ended up here, married
Nancy.
Nancy,
Yeah.
who had several husbands later
Right.
because they all died.
Yeah.
But their son, William Allaire Jr., went to West Point
It's neat.
from this hotel, growing up in this hotel. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. So, in what was typical at the time, the lower floor would have been shops, and the upper floor would have been rooms. But we know that it was a prosperous hotel, and because it survived so long, if nothing else. The St. Charles Hotel also played a role in our town's most famous Civil War event. Confederate General Jeff Thompson, known as the Swamp Fox of the Confederacy because his ability to evade capture for long periods of time, was captured at the St. Charles Hotel. Late in 1863, he was captured at the St. Charles. He basically was surprised when the Union troops rode into the court square. He was captured. Interestingly enough, if you want to know more about him, stop in at the museum. I'll be glad to sell you a biography about him. We sell several of those. He was captured, but as was pretty common during the Civil War, he negotiated his freedom pretty quickly and was right back on the battlefield again. He was supposed to not fight on the battlefield, but he came right back and he was fighting again. Also in 1863, Union soldiers set fire to much of downtown Pocahontas, though they spared the St. Charles Hotel because they wanted to use it as their headquarters. And they did so. In 1865, they're using it as their headquarters, and a group of Confederate soldiers ride into town and want to surrender. They know the war's over, they know they've lost, so they want to surrender. And they must have startled the troops because they were massacred. They weren't allowed to surrender. 16 Confederate troops were killed on Bettis Street in front of the hotel, and we often refer to that as the St. Charles Massacre. The St. Charles Hotel continued to operate after the war under the management of Aunt Nancy Jones. As Linda mentioned, she's had a succession of husbands at this point, and she is still the owner and the manager of the hotel. It was known for its good food and amenities. Everyday lunch and dinner was announced by the ringing of a giant gong in the lobby, which could be heard all over town.
After she was married to Allaire, and I think he died in 59 or 57, 18.
You're right.
She was married to Evans, who was the Confederate recruiter who was murdered by Union troops in the lobby. So Allaire and then Evans, she was married, he died, and then Jones.
And if John Allen was here, he could tell us a lot because he's done a lot of research on that hotel and has a fascination with that hotel. She continued to run this until she sold the building in the 1920s. And interestingly enough, the building burned on the same day she sold it. She sold it to Randolph County Bank, and then that very night it burned. The only portion that remained was the brick portion that's being restored now. So, anything you want to tell us about that part?
It was built in 1860, the brick addition.
Yep.
No, 59.
Okay.
1859.
And I mean, it's amazing. You look at the picture here and look at the building today. I find that amazing. Because I remember when it had rock on the front and had different offices in it. So speaking of the things that it had in it, that building later went on to house several things, including a brothel on the second floor, allegedly at least, and multiple bars. By 1916, the Pocahontas Herald, we saw the earlier location, but by 1916, the Herald is located in that building, as well as a barber shop. And on the second floor, there's a telephone office. And you see 3 images of the Herald here, including one with the big press, which I find interesting. These are believed to be in that building. And then on that corner where Mary Rapert has her office today, that's housed a restaurant and multiple things over the years as well. So let's talk a little bit about Moore Street. And my favorite picture of Pocahontas is the next one on Moore Street. Do you see the guy walking the tightrope?
I love that picture.
I'm really curious to see what it's secured to on the other side. It has to be the old courthouse, but
Yeah.
still. This is Merchant's Day. That's what the picture is entitled. And several things stand out. You see the Turner Saloon,